In 1933, an enterprising young Texan named Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant opened up a bar in Hollywood called Don the Beachcomber. Inspired by his travels in the South Pacific, he decorated the place with bamboo, fishing nets, and Polynesian tchotchkes, and he garnished his rum-based drinks with colorful cocktail umbrellas. And so Tiki was born. It exploded after World War II as servicemen returning from the Pacific Theater spurred a craze for all things Polynesian. And now Tiki is back. With the opening of several high-profile Tiki bars in New York and across the country, the tropical kitsch of Tiki is once again in vogue. But where does kitsch end and uncomfortable cultural appropriation begin? Here to talk Tiki with us is Shannon Mustafer. Shannon, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be at BRIC.
So you have a new book out about Tiki. How did you get your start making specifically Tiki cocktails?
It all started with rum. So 4 years ago, or rather 5, on April 4th, I became beverage director of Gladys Caribbean in Crown Heights.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And the mission initially was to create the most diverse selection of traditional Caribbean-style rums in Brooklyn, if not all of NYC. So you have to bear in mind that this is 5 years ago, and there were no Tiki bars in New York. There were some Tiki drinks here and there, but due to the lack of quality options of rum, they weren't shining examples of what the genre could do.
Right, and I think people often think of Tiki and they think of super sweet drinks.
That couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, yes, there are examples of those in the canon, but that was never the intention initially.
We're in a moment where we're really asking questions about cultural appropriation and who gets to cook the cuisine of cultures. Can that come from people from outside the culture? Talk to me a little bit about Tiki, because I feel like we haven't really discussed that as a cocktail drinking culture about, are the origins of Tiki racist? Are depictions of Pacific Islanders in, say, like Tiki glasses, do we think that those are racist? What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's helpful to think about the context of where Tiki began. So for those of you who are less familiar, Tiki really took off in America following World War II. So you have GIs returning from the Pacific Theater on one hand. You also have more accessibility around air travel for the public in general, and a fascination with what was considered exotic at the time. You know, America back then, I would say, was fairly homogenous once you moved away from the coast, and there are a lot of people that didn't have exposure to cultures outside of, you know, being a Caucasian or white American. And so I believe there's a sort of innocence in regards to this, and I don't see evidence of anything that was about appropriation per se, or making, you know, something entertainment at the expense of another culture. I mean, to be quite frank, I don't think that there was enough conversation around this sort of topic back then for it to even be on the map.
Right. I think that's true, that there was a lack of conversation. And I think one of the things that people say in defense of Tiki is that at this point, it actually is divorced from Polynesian culture entirely, that it's really about mid-century Americana. That said, I wonder if there are any of this new wave of Tiki bars. There have been like some high-profile openings, as I've mentioned, the Polynesian, for example, here in New York. Are any of them trying to incorporate authentic, contemporary Asian Pacific Islander culture? Like, is there a discussion about, I don't know, about maybe like political issues facing, you know, Asian Pacific Island natives or anything like that within the Tiki community?
So I can speak primarily from my experience and what I've observed in my colleagues and how they approach making drinks.
Yes, would love that.
It's about flavor.
Mm-hmm.
It's about innovation. It's about creating a welcoming environment. That's what aloha means. It's about what we call ohana spirit. And yes, that is appropriated from Polynesian culture. But the whole notion is that there's a fantasy and there's escapism and there's a way to take the edge off of life. You have to keep in mind that when Don the Beachcomber opened in LA in the late 30s, we're still in the Great Depression. And hence its popularity for maybe $1 total you could forget about your day-to-day, which was rather dreary for most Americans. And that was the whole spirit behind the choice of culture that was referenced in those environments. And the exoticism is an escape.
What can we expect in your book?
The layout of the book and the progression starts with what I call the foundational rum cocktails that guide you through the major categories, get you familiar with the flavor profiles, so you have that foundation to go from. And then it's followed by a chapter called the essential tiki drinks, which I consider to be the mother sauces of the genre. And everything that comes from that is an extrapolation on those classics. And they include the Planter's Punch, the Mai Tai, the Zombie, and a few others, some of them more popular, some more obscure. But the templates, the flavors, and the ingredients all play into the recipes that follow.
Great. Well, I'm ready to drink one of those cocktails. So, Shannon, you're going to make us a cocktail from your book. Tell me about it.
This is the Kingston sound system. So, lime, soursop, which is kind of like a prickly pear in lieu of pineapple, Sue's liqueur, and then rum fire, an overproof, unaged rum, but the thing that makes it special is that it's made in a pot still and it has extra long fermentation on it. So we're gonna do 3/4 ounces of lime. And you know, for those of you who are a little less familiar with cocktail building, it's important to do your sour and sweet first so that you can check it as you go. Okay, now we're gonna do the Sue's, that's 1/2 ounce. Now, rum fire is overproof, so rather than the full 2 ounces that you find in typical recipes,
Take mercy
I'm gonna
on us.
do, well, I'm gonna do an 1.5 ounces.
Okay.
Because you don't actually need a full 2 ounces.
I mean,
here.
one of the things that I love about tiki is that it is sort of a fusion, an American fusion, right? Because you do have some of these like Polynesian or Pacific Islander flavors, but then you also have rum, which is like Caribbean in nature. You don't see a lot of rum indigenous to Polynesia or Asia. How did rum become the building block of tiki?
Okay, again, keep in mind, this is after Prohibition, and American distilleries have been defunct for some time, which means that the stock of spirits available was very limited and very expensive. Rum was what we reached for because it was accessible and I don't want to say cheap, but it was non-cost prohibitive.
Very good. Non-cost prohibitive. There you go.
And so that's how it came about. Meanwhile, Don Beach, who's a pioneer in using rum in cocktails and blending different rums and different juices and coming up with really sophisticated flavor profiles, had done a lot of travel in the Caribbean as well as the Pacific, and you know, was very inspired by that experience. So you need to do this until I call it 2 cold holds. Because that means that you get the most dilution, the ice and the water expand and allow the spirits to mellow somewhat. You get more aroma there. And then, as befits tiki, some festive garnish. Here I'm using a lime wheel, some pineapples, and a fancy straw.
No umbrella.
Not necessary. Cheers, my dear.
Thank you. This looks great. That's delicious. And as I was saying earlier, that I think a lot of people are like, oh, tiki, sugar bomb, hangover. Not sweet at all. Very balanced. And the bitterness from the stews really comes across perfectly. Thank you for taking us into the depths of tiki, Shannon. Really a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.